A 911 call crackles through the radio. A sheriff's voice, panicked, breathless, reports that his 8-year-old son has fallen down the stairs. But as investigators arrive at the sprawling mountain estate, something doesn't add up. The blood spatter patterns tell a different story. The defensive wounds paint a darker picture. And clutched in the dead child's hand are green fibers, evidence of a desperate final struggle. This isn't a tragic accident. It's murder. And the killer? His own 13-year-old brother. What happened inside that picture-perfect Colorado home would expose a family's darkest secrets, reveal a sheriff's corruption, and spark a national debate about justice, mental illness, and whether a child can be beyond redemption. This is the story of Lucas Lopez, a case that asks the question, when a child kills, who's really responsible? Before we dive into this devastating case, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. If you find yourself gripped by what unfolds here, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? And what do you think about cases involving juvenile offenders? Let's discuss. Now, let's uncover the truth. The evening of March 15th, 2022, started like any other in Millbrook, Colorado, a wealthy enclave nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where million-dollar homes perched on manicured lots, and the biggest concerns were usually about HOA violations or ski season traffic. But at 6:47 p.m., everything changed. The radio crackled to life with a call that would shatter the community's sense of safety and expose secrets that had been festering behind closed doors for years. The voice on the line was breathless, frantic, unmistakable. It was Sheriff Marcus Harrington himself, reporting that his youngest son had fallen down the stairs at their sprawling estate. To the sparse police units scattered across this affluent suburb outside Aspen, the Harrington address was all too familiar. It was the kind of property that represented the American dream. 5 pristine acres with panoramic views of snow-capped peaks painted crimson and gold by the setting sun. Sheriff Harrington was a fixture in the community, the kind of man who showed up at every town council meeting with a firm handshake and reassuring words about public safety. His wife, Jacqueline, ran a popular mommy blog where she shared picture-perfect moments of their photogenic family hiking, skiing, and living what seemed like an enviable life. But as the first responders would soon discover, the pristine facade hid something rotten underneath, something that had been growing more dangerous with each passing day. Paramedic Sarah Jennings was the first medical professional through the door, her boots pounding across hardwood floors as Sheriff Harrington gestured frantically toward the base of the grand staircase. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her career. 8-year-old Ethan Thompson lay crumpled at an impossible angle, his small body surrounded by a pool of blood that had already begun to congeal in the cool air of the foyer. The child's skull showed obvious trauma, devastating, catastrophic injuries that no one could survive. But it was the other injuries that immediately caught Jennings's trained eye, and they told a story that didn't match the sheriff's frantic explanation of a simple fall. There were defensive wounds on Ethan's forearms, bruising that suggested he'd been struck multiple times, and most tellingly, a pattern of blood spatter on the wall that seemed wildly inconsistent with a tumble down the stairs. Sheriff Harrington hovered nearby, his uniform still crisp despite the horror of the scene. Repeating the same story over and over like a mantra, he was trying to convince himself to believe. Ethan had been playing upstairs, he said. There was a crash. When he rushed to investigate, he found his son at the bottom of the stairs. It was simple. It was tragic. It was an accident. But the evidence whispered something different, something darker. The arrival of State Police Detective Reginald Torres 20 minutes later would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the investigation and mark the moment when this stopped being treated as a family tragedy and started being investigated as what it really was, a homicide. Torres, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for methodical crime scene analysis, had been dining with his family at a restaurant in Aspen proper when the call came through about an officer-involved incident requiring state oversight. He walked into the Harrington home with the careful, measured steps of someone who knew that first impressions of a crime scene could make or break a case. His dark eyes swept across the opulent entryway with its vaulted ceilings and original artwork, taking in details that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. Sheriff Harrington immediately tried to assert control, explaining that this was clearly an accident and didn't require the heavy hand of state investigation. But Torres calmly informed him that any death involving a law enforcement officer's family would be handled by an independent team, no exceptions. The tension between the two men was palpable, a clash of jurisdictions and egos playing out while a child's body grew cold on expensive Italian tile. The forensic team that descended on the Millbrook property transformed the pristine home into a grid of evidence markers and camera flashes. Lead crime scene investigator Patricia Mendez directed her team with quiet efficiency, photographing blood spatter patterns that told a story wildly different from the one Sheriff Harrington was selling. The blood on the wall showed a cast-off pattern, the kind created when blood is flung from an object in motion, like a weapon being swung repeatedly. This wasn't the splash pattern you'd expect from a body tumbling downstairs. Ethan's defensive wounds, scrapes and bruises on his forearms and hands, suggested he had tried to protect himself from an attack, raising his arms to ward off blows from someone standing over him. Most tellingly, the position of the body seemed staged, arranged too neatly at the base of the stairs rather than sprawled in the chaotic aftermath of an actual fall. Detective Torres stood to the side, watching Sheriff Harrington's face as each new piece of evidence emerged, noting how the man's jaw tightened and his hands clenched whenever Mendez made a notation that contradicted the accident narrative. As the evening wore into night and portable lights were set up to illuminate the scene, a state police officer discovered something that would become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. Clutched in Ethan's small fist, gripped with the desperate strength of someone fighting for their life, were several green fibers. The child's fingers were curled around them so tightly that it took careful work to extract them without damaging the evidence. Detective Torres photographed the fibers before they were bagged, his mind already racing through the implications. If Ethan had grabbed onto his attacker during the struggle, those fibers could be the key to identifying who had actually killed him. The Harrington family members were separated and placed in different rooms of the house for preliminary questioning, a standard procedure that Sheriff Harrington protested loudly until Torres reminded him that he was now a witness in a death investigation, not the lead investigator. In the living room, 13-year-old Lucas Lopez sat on a leather sofa, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around him. His distinctive green hoodie was draped over the back of a chair, its forest green color matching the fibers found in his dead brother's hand, though at this point, no one had made that connection yet. His mother, Jacqueline Harrington, sat beside him with red-rimmed eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch her surviving son's shoulder as if to confirm he was still there, still alive, while her youngest lay dead just rooms away. The initial interviews revealed troubling inconsistencies that transformed the investigation from a potential accident review into an active homicide case. Sheriff Harrington insisted he'd been in his home office working on reports when he heard the crash, but his teenage daughter told investigators she'd seen her father in the garage around that time. Jacqueline Harrington's timeline for when she last saw Ethan alive shifted multiple times during questioning, first saying it was 6:30 p.m., then 6:15 p.m., then admitting she wasn't entirely sure. But it was Lucas Lopez's interview that raised the most red flags. When asked what he'd been doing that evening, he stated flatly that he'd been in his room playing video games, never leaving except to use the bathroom around 6 p.m. Detective Torres noted that the boy showed no emotion when discussing his dead brother. No tears, no shock, just a blank effect that could indicate either severe trauma or something far more sinister. The pieces weren't fitting together, and as Torres looked around at this wealthy family in their million-dollar home, he knew that the Real story was buried beneath layers of secrets and lies. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment, delivered to Detective Torres at around 11 p.m. that night, confirmed his darkest suspicions. Dr. Raymond Chun, speaking in the precise language of forensic pathology, explained that Ethan Thompson had suffered blunt force trauma from at least 3 separate impacts, with the fatal blow striking the back of his skull while he was in a kneeling position. The injury pattern was completely inconsistent with a fall downstairs, which typically produced different types of trauma distributed across multiple body surfaces. Dr. Chun pointed to contusions on Ethan's back and shoulders that suggested he'd been struck from behind, possibly while trying to crawl away from his attacker. The time of death was estimated between 6:15 p.m. and 6:45 p.m., a window that encompassed the sheriff's 911 call, but also raised disturbing questions about how long Ethan had lain dying before help was summoned. Had someone waited? Had someone watched as the child's life slipped away? Torres thanked the medical examiner and walked back into the Harrington home, where the family still waited in separate rooms, none of them yet aware that this was no longer being treated as an accident. The night was far from over, and before dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, the investigation would take turns that no one, not the community, not the media, not even the seasoned investigators, could have anticipated. The decision to focus on Lucas Lopez as a potential suspect came not from intuition or gut feeling, but from methodical analysis of the physical evidence that was beginning to pile up. The green fibers found in Ethan's hand were rushed to the state crime lab, where textile analysts worked through the night to determine their composition. They matched the specific blend of cotton and polyester used in a particular brand of athletic hoodie, and that same hoodie was photographed on the back of the living room chair where Lucas had been sitting, its distinctive forest green color and brand logo clearly visible in the evidence photos. When investigators examined Lucas's sneakers, size 7 Nike high tops with a distinctive tread pattern, they found something even more damning. A partial bloody footprint near Ethan's body appeared to match perfectly. The constellation of physical evidence was beginning to point in a direction that Detective Torres found both tragic and infuriating, toward a 13-year-old boy who had apparently killed his younger brother in this affluent Colorado home while their law enforcement father worked just rooms away. But Torres knew he needed more than physical evidence, no matter how compelling. He needed to understand what could drive a child to commit such violence. What had been happening in this picture-perfect family that could lead to one brother bludgeoning another to death? As investigators continued processing the scene through the early morning hours, they had no idea just how deep the dysfunction ran, or how many people had seen warning signs and done nothing to prevent the tragedy that had just unfolded. The Harrington family's public image had always been one of wholesome American values and enviable success, the kind of family that made their neighbors simultaneously admire and envy them. Sheriff Marcus Harrington was more than just a law enforcement officer. He was a pillar of the Millbrook community, a man who seemed to embody everything right about small-town America. He showed up at youth sports events cheering from the sidelines, attended church services every Sunday with his family in tow, and was always ready with reassuring words about public safety at town council meetings. His presence was commanding, his handshake firm, and his reputation seemingly unimpeachable. But as Detective Torres would soon discover, that reputation had been carefully constructed and ruthlessly maintained through intimidation, cover-ups, and an abuse of power that went far beyond anything the community could have imagined. Jacqueline Harrington had her own sphere of influence, and in many ways, it was even more insidious than her husband's. She ran a wildly popular mommy blog called Mountain Mama Musings, where she shared parenting tips, family recipes, and inspirational quotes against a backdrop of carefully curated photos. Her Instagram feed was a masterclass in aspirational living. Images of her photogenic family hiking through aspen groves, skiing down pristine slopes, and enjoying quality time together in their beautiful home. Her followers numbered in the tens of thousands, drawn to her seemingly authentic portrayal of balanced motherhood and her relatable struggles with raising children in the modern world. The family's Christmas cards were legendary in Millbrook, professional photos of the Harringtons in matching outfits against stunning Rocky Mountain backdrops, sent to everyone from local business owners to state politicians. They were the family everyone wanted to be. But as Detective Torres began pulling at the threads of this perfect family tapestry, he discovered that the image was a carefully constructed lie designed to hide dysfunction, violence, and a child spiraling toward catastrophe while the adults around him looked the other way or actively profited from his suffering. The investigation into the family's background would reveal a pattern of behavior so disturbing that it would eventually lead to criminal charges against both parents, transforming a murder case into something much larger, an indictment of parental neglect, systemic failure, and the dangers of prioritizing image over reality. What Torres uncovered in those first days after Ethan's death would shock even veteran investigators who thought they'd seen everything. Detective Reginald Torres's formal assumption of command over the crime scene marked a critical turning point in the investigation, one that Sheriff Marcus Harrington fought with every ounce of his professional and political capital. The sheriff wasn't going down without a fight. He placed calls to the county commissioner, the mayor of Aspen, and even a state senator, all people he'd cultivated relationships with over his 18-year career in law enforcement. These weren't just professional connections. They were political allies who owed him favors, who had benefited from his support during their own campaigns and controversies. Harrington was calling in every chip he had, trying to leverage his influence to maintain control over an investigation that was rapidly slipping away from him. But Torres had something even more powerful on his side: the full backing of the state police superintendent, who understood that any death in a law enforcement family required not just independent oversight, but the appearance of absolute impartiality to maintain public trust. By 2 a.m. on March 16, 2022, Sheriff Harrington was officially relieved of any role in the investigation, forced to sit in his own home as state police methodically dismantled the narrative he'd tried to construct. The look on his face as Torres delivered the news was one of barely controlled rage mixed with something that looked almost like panic. For a man accustomed to being in control, to wielding authority without question, this reversal of power was devastating. He was no longer the sheriff investigating a tragedy. He was a witness in a homicide case, and as the evidence continued to mount, it was becoming increasingly clear that he might become something more: a suspect in a conspiracy to cover up his son's crime. The forensic analysis of the blood spatter patterns proved to be the first major break in unraveling the truth behind Ethan Thompson's death. Patricia Mendez, the lead crime scene investigator, spent hours documenting the distribution and characteristics of blood throughout the foyer and staircase area, working with the precision of someone who understood that every droplet told part of the story. The pattern on the wall showed elongated droplets consistent with cast-off spatter, the kind created when blood is flung from an object in motion, like a weapon being swung repeatedly in overhead strikes. The angle and distribution of these droplets allowed Mendez to triangulate the position of both attacker and victim with remarkable precision. Ethan had been on his knees, possibly begging or trying to protect himself, while his killer stood behind and above him, bringing down blow after devastating blow. This wasn't the chaotic tumble of a child falling downstairs. This was calculated. This was brutal. This was, for all intents and purposes, an execution dressed up to look like an accident. The defensive wounds on Ethan's body painted an even more heartbreaking picture of his final moments. And as Dr. Raymond Chen's detailed autopsy revealed the full extent of the 8-year-old's injuries, even hardened investigators found themselves struggling with the emotional weight of what they were uncovering. Ethan had sustained injuries to his hands and forearms consistent with trying to ward off blows from above. The universal human instinct to protect oneself, to raise your arms and shield your head when violence rains down. There were bruises in the pattern of small fingers on Ethan's shoulders, suggesting someone had grabbed him and held him in place, preventing him from escaping the attack. A closer examination of the child's knees revealed carpet fibers and minor abrasions that supported the theory he'd been forced into a kneeling position before the fatal blow was struck. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It was methodical, controlled, and utterly merciless. Dr. Chun noted in his report something that would become crucial evidence. One of the defensive injuries, a deep bruise on Ethan's right forearm, matched the diameter of the tactical flashlight that every Aspen County Sheriff's deputy carried on their duty belt. The weapon was heavy enough to deliver lethal force, small enough to be wielded by a teenager, and significantly, Sheriff Harrington's flashlight was missing from his duty belt when investigators asked to examine his equipment. Where was it? Who had taken it? And why? These questions would drive the investigation forward, leading investigators down paths that revealed not just a murder, but a web of dysfunction and failure that had made that murder inevitable. The green fibers clutched in Ethan's hand became the subject of intense scrutiny at the state crime lab in Denver, where textile analyst Dr. Samantha Wells worked with meticulous care to identify their origin. She placed the fibers under a comparison microscope alongside samples cut from Lucas Lopez's hoodie, examining them at magnifications up to 400x. The level of detail she could see at that magnification was extraordinary. Every twist of the thread, every irregularity in the weave, every characteristic that made these fibers unique. And they matched. The fibers matched in every observable characteristic: color, diameter, cross-sectional shape, and the specific ratio of cotton to synthetic materials. Dr. Wells also identified a distinctive irregularity in the weave pattern, a slight imperfection that occurred during manufacturing, the kind of random flaw that appears in mass-produced items but makes each one subtly unique. That same irregularity appeared in both the evidence fibers and the hoodie samples. The statistical probability of these fibers coming from a different garment was calculated at less than 1 in 50,000. When combined with the fact that Lucas owned and had been wearing a hoodie of this exact description on the day of the murder, the fiber evidence became nearly irrefutable proof that Ethan had grabbed onto his older brother during the attack, desperate for mercy that never came. It was evidence that would be impossible for the defense to explain away, physical proof of contact between victim and killer at the moment of violence. And it was just the beginning of the forensic case that was building against 13-year-old Lucas Lopez. The bloody footprint discovered near Ethan's body provided another crucial piece of the forensic puzzle, adding yet another layer to the mounting evidence. Shoe print analyst Mark Richardson photographed and measured the partial print with exacting precision, documenting how it showed the distinctive waffle pattern of a Nike high-top sneaker in size 7. The print had been made in Ethan's blood, meaning the person who left it had stepped in the pooled blood after the fatal injuries were inflicted, after Ethan was already dying or dead. Richardson compared the evidence print to exemplars taken from every member of the Harrington household, systematically eliminating possibilities until only one match remained: the Nike high tops that Lucas had kicked off in the mudroom when he came downstairs after the attack. But it wasn't just a general match to a common shoe type. It was far more specific than that. The pattern of wear on Lucas's sneakers matched the evidence print perfectly, including a small defect in the tread where a piece of rubber had torn away from the sole, creating a unique identifying characteristic. This wasn't circumstantial evidence that could be explained away. This was a specific, individualized match to one particular pair of sneakers worn by one particular person on the night Ethan Thompson was murdered. The footprint told investigators that Lucas had stood over his brother's dying body, close enough to step in the blood, and the placement suggested he might have been watching, waiting to see if Ethan would survive or if the job was done. Detective Torres knew that physical evidence alone, while compelling and powerful, wouldn't fully explain the why behind this tragedy. Why would a 13-year-old boy kill his younger brother? What had driven him to that point? The answer to those questions lay in Lucas's digital footprint, and Torres obtained a warrant to seize all electronic devices in the Harrington home. Lucas's smartphone was turned over to digital forensics specialist Angela Ramirez, a wizard with data recovery who had cracked some of the most challenging cases in Colorado's recent history. What she discovered on that phone would transform the case from a tragic incident of family violence into clear evidence of premeditated, first-degree murder. Ramirez discovered that Lucas had attempted to delete his search history on the evening of March 12, 2022, exactly 3 days before Ethan's death. Someone less skilled might have missed the deleted data, but Ramirez used forensic recovery software to resurrect the searches, bringing them back from the digital grave where Lucas had tried to bury them. And what those searches revealed was chilling. They read like a how-to guide for getting away with murder, a teenager's roadmap to fratricide. How to make murder look like accident. Can a kid go to jail for killing brother? How long does DNA last? And do stairs kill people? The timing and content of these searches demonstrated premeditation. Lucas hadn't acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage. He had planned his brother's death for at least 3 days, giving him ample time to reconsider, to choose differently, to seek help. He didn't. Instead, he researched, he planned, and then he executed that plan with devastating effectiveness. The confrontation between Detective Torres and Sheriff Harrington in the early hours of March 16, 2022, revealed the depth of the sheriff's desperation to control a narrative that was rapidly spiraling beyond his grasp. Harrington demanded to know why state police were treating his family tragedy like a crime scene, why his son's body had been taken to Denver for autopsy rather than handled locally by people he knew and trusted, why his home was still crawling with investigators when the accident, he kept calling it an accident, was so obviously explained. His voice rose with each question, the authority he was accustomed to wielding seeming to slip through his fingers like sand. But Torres remained calm, almost unnervingly so, as he methodically presented the evidence that had been accumulating throughout the night. The blood spatter analysis that contradicted a fall, the fiber match between Lucas's hoodie and the material found in Ethan's hand, the the footprint that placed Lucas at the scene, the deleted searches that revealed planning and intent. Torres watched the sheriff's face transform as each piece of evidence was laid out, from indignation to shock to something that looked almost like resignation, as if some part of him had known this moment was coming, had perhaps known it since the instant he saw Ethan's body and understood what his other son had done. Harrington made one final attempt to assert parental authority, asking if he could speak with his son alone to help Lucas process the trauma of losing his brother. It was a reasonable request on its surface, the kind of thing any parent might ask. But Torres denied it immediately, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Lucas was now the primary suspect in a homicide investigation, he explained, and any contact between family members would need to be monitored and documented. The sheriff's carefully maintained composure finally cracked at those words, and he sank into a chair, his head in his hands, muttering that this couldn't be happening to his family, not to them, not with everything he'd built and protected over the years. Jacqueline Harrington's reaction to the mounting evidence against her son was markedly different from her husband's, and in some ways, even more revealing of the family's dysfunction. When Torres informed her that Lucas was being considered a suspect rather than a grieving sibling, she didn't break down or demand answers. Instead, she immediately lawyered up, demanding an attorney and refusing to answer any further questions without legal representation present. Her social media accounts, which had been public-facing platforms for her Mountain Mama musings brand and a window into their seemingly perfect life, were swiftly set to private within hours of Ethan's death. The carefully curated photos of her happy family vanished from public view, replaced by a terse statement expressing grief over Ethan's passing and requesting privacy during this difficult time. But investigators had already archived her entire digital presence, screenshots and downloads that preserved everything she was now trying to hide. And what they found in her blog posts and social media updates painted a disturbing picture of a mother who had recognized her older son's escalating violence, but had chosen to monetize his struggles rather than get him proper help. Torres assigned an investigator specifically to analyze Jacqueline's online presence, sensing that the family's public image was about to provide critical context for understanding how tragedy had been allowed to fester behind closed doors. The investigator, a young detective named Sarah Chun who specialized in digital evidence and social media analysis, would spend days combing through years of blog posts, Instagram captions, and sponsored content. What she discovered would eventually become some of the most damaging evidence against Jacqueline Harrington, revealing a level of exploitation and neglect that shocked even seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen every variety of bad parenting. But that revelation would come later. For now, the focus remained on building the case against Lucas, on documenting every piece of evidence that proved beyond reasonable doubt that he had murdered his brother. The size 7 Nike footprint took on additional significance when investigators reconstructed the timeline of events using the blood spatter patterns, body position, and the location of the footprint relative to Ethan's body. Forensic analysts determined that the bloody print had been made after the fatal blow was struck, during what they termed the post-assault phase of the crime. This suggested something deeply disturbing, that Lucas had stood over his brother's dying body, possibly watching to ensure Ethan was dead before leaving the scene. The coldness of that act, the calculated nature of it, combined with the premeditation shown by the deleted searches, began to paint a picture of a deeply disturbed adolescent whose capacity for violence had been steadily escalating. This wasn't a crime of passion, a momentary loss of control that anyone might theoretically understand. This was something else entirely, something that suggested a fundamental lack of empathy, a disconnection from normal human emotional responses. Detective Torres knew from experience that children didn't usually commit premeditated murder without warning signs, clear indicators that something was seriously wrong long before violence erupted, which meant someone in Ethan's life had likely seen this coming. Maybe not the specific act, but the potential for serious violence, and failed to intervene. The question that would haunt this case, that would follow it through trials and appeals and national media coverage, was whether that failure constituted criminal negligence or something even worse. Were the parents merely negligent, or had they actively enabled their son's violence through cover-ups and inaction? That question would be answered as investigators dug deeper into the family's history, uncovering incident after incident that had been swept under the rug by a sheriff who valued his reputation more than his children's safety. The tactical flashlight that had likely served as the murder weapon was discovered in a trash can behind a shopping center 2 miles from the Harrington home, found by a sanitation worker on the morning of March 16th, who recognized it as law enforcement equipment and had the presence of mind to turn it over to the Aspen Police Department rather than simply disposing of it. When state investigators tested the flashlight for blood evidence, they found trace amounts of Ethan's blood in the grooves of the handle and around the bezel, microscopic remnants that had survived a hasty cleaning attempt. The flashlight's serial number matched the department-issued equipment assigned to Sheriff Marcus Harrington, though fingerprint analysis revealed that the last person to handle it had been Lucas Lopez. This discovery raised troubling questions about how a 13-year-old had accessed his father's duty equipment and whether Sheriff Harrington had been aware that his son had taken the weapon. Had he noticed it missing? Had Lucas taken it with his father's knowledge? Or had he stolen it without detection? The flashlight also explained the specific pattern of injuries on Ethan's skull with brutal clarity. The heavy rubberized body of the tactical light, designed to withstand rough handling and deliver powerful illumination, had essentially functioned as a club when wielded with intent to harm. Each impact had delivered devastating force concentrated in a relatively small area, maximizing the trauma to Ethan's brain. Dr. Chin's autopsy report noted that the cylindrical shape of the flashlight matched the contusions perfectly, creating a weapon signature that was as clear as a fingerprint. The flashlight had been designed to help officers see in the dark, to illuminate danger and provide safety. In Lucas's hands, it had become an instrument of death, turned against the most vulnerable person in the household, a child who should have been protected, not hunted. As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains on March 16, 2022, the Harrington home remained an active crime scene, surrounded by yellow tape and state police vehicles that seemed wildly out of place in this affluent neighborhood. Neighbors in the Millbrook community began emerging from their homes, gathering in small clusters on driveways and sidewalks, speaking in hushed tones about the tragedy that had shattered their sense of security. This was the kind of place where people moved to escape urban crime, where they paid premium prices for safety and exclusivity. And now murder had visited them, not from some external threat, but from within one of their own families. Several neighbors approached investigators, volunteering information that painted a very different picture of the Harringtons than their public image suggested. They described tension in the family, arguments that could be heard from the street, Lucas's increasingly withdrawn and troubled demeanor in recent months. One neighbor, a woman named Jennifer Martinez who lived 3 houses down, told investigators something particularly significant. She'd noticed Lucas seemed troubled and withdrawn, and there had been loud arguments audible from the street on several occasions over the past year. But more than that, she reported having called Child Protective Services the previous summer after witnessing Sheriff Harrington violently disciplining Lucas in the front yard, an incident that had disturbed her enough to risk making an enemy of a law enforcement official. The complaint had been closed without action after the sheriff claimed he'd simply been restraining his son during a mental health episode, using language that made it sound like he was being a responsible parent dealing with a crisis rather than engaging in abuse. Martinez told investigators she'd felt intimidated into backing down, worried that pushing the issue would put her family at risk of retaliation from someone with the sheriff's power and connections. These revelations painted a picture of a community that had seen warning signs but had been reluctant to challenge a law enforcement family's authority, allowing dysfunction to escalate until it ended in murder. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout the investigation. People who had noticed problems, who had felt concerned, who had even tried to intervene, but who had been shut down by the Harringtons' wealth, status, and connections. The system that should have protected children like Lucas and Ethan had failed them repeatedly, and now one child was dead, while the other faced spending his life in prison. The tragedy was compounded by the knowledge that it might have been preventable if just one of those interventions had been taken seriously, if one of those warning signs had been acted upon with appropriate urgency. The forensic analysis of Lucas Lopez's green hoodie transformed it from a simple piece of clothing into one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case, a silent witness that contradicted every claim of innocence or accident. When textile expert Dr. Samantha Wells examined the garment under specialized lighting designed to reveal biological evidence invisible to the naked eye, she discovered microscopic blood spatter on the sleeves and front panel. DNA analysis confirmed this blood belonged to Ethan Thompson, and the distribution pattern was consistent with being in close proximity to the victim during a violent attack, the kind of fine mist that results when blood is aerosolized by impact force. The spatter was classified as impact spatter, created when blood breaks into small droplets due to the force of a blow, exactly what would occur if Lucas had been standing over Ethan while repeatedly striking him with a tactical flashlight. Most significantly, the hoodie showed evidence of having been laundered after the murder, with chemical analysis detecting trace amounts of bleach in areas where blood spatter was found. This suggested that Lucas had attempted to destroy evidence before investigators could collect the garment, demonstrating consciousness of guilt and an understanding that what he'd done was wrong and would need to be hidden. The attempted cleaning showed sophistication, planning, and awareness of forensic science that was unusual for a 13-year-old. But bleach, while effective at breaking down blood proteins, doesn't eliminate all traces, especially when used hastily. The microscopic evidence remained, preserved in the fabric's weave where casual cleaning couldn't reach, waiting to tell its story to investigators who knew where to look. The size 7 Nike sneakers removed from Lucas's feet on the night of the murder underwent exhaustive testing at the state crime lab, with analysts examining every crevice and groove for evidence. Beyond the tread pattern that matched the bloody footprint, they discovered additional blood evidence in the grooves of the sole, concentrated in areas where casual cleaning might miss. The deep channels and textured surfaces that give athletic shoes their grip. DNA testing confirmed this blood was Ethan's, and the distribution pattern indicated Lucas had walked through a significant pool of blood, consistent with standing over his brother's body after the fatal blows. The sneakers also contained trace amounts of carpet fiber from 2 different locations: the upstairs hallway where the attack was believed to have begun, and the living room carpet near where Ethan's body had been found. This fiber transfer evidence allowed investigators to track Lucas's movements through the crime scene, creating a map of the pursuit and attack that ended in fratricide. The deleted internet searches on Lucas's smartphone proved to be a gold mine of evidence demonstrating not just premeditation, but a level of planning that was frankly disturbing in someone so young. Digital forensics specialist Angela Ramirez recovered not just the searches themselves, but the timestamps and the sequence in which they were conducted, revealing that Lucas had spent nearly 45 minutes on March 12, 2022, researching how to commit and cover up a murder. This wasn't casual browsing or morbid curiosity. It was focused research with a clear purpose. He'd visited forums where people discussed unsolved crimes, reading through threads about cases where killers had gotten away with it, and analyzing what had gone wrong for those who were caught. He'd read articles about forensic science and crime scene investigation, educating himself about the techniques that would be used to investigate his brother's death. He'd even watched YouTube videos explaining how blood spatter analysis worked, essentially studying the very methods that would eventually be used to prove his guilt. The sophistication of his research suggested a teenager who understood exactly what he was planning and had taken deliberate steps to educate himself about avoiding detection. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a momentary loss of control. This was calculated in a way that made everyone who reviewed the evidence deeply uncomfortable, because it suggested a capacity for cold planning that seemed incompatible with childhood innocence. Ramirez also recovered deleted text messages between Lucas and a friend in which he complained about Ethan ruining everything, and stated that he wished his younger brother would just disappear. While the friend had apparently dismissed these comments as typical sibling rivalry, the kind of thing brothers say to each other when they're frustrated, they now took on sinister new meaning in light of Ethan's death. Had Lucas been telegraphing his intentions? Had he been testing the waters, seeing if anyone would take his threat seriously? Or had these been idle complaints that later crystallized into actual intent? The answers to those questions would matter tremendously as the case moved toward prosecution. Detective Torres arranged for Lucas to be formally interviewed on March 17, 2022, with his court-appointed attorney present and with the entire session being video recorded. Standard procedure for juvenile interrogations that would protect everyone's rights while preserving an accurate record of what was said. The interrogation room at the state police headquarters in Aspen was deliberately designed to be psychologically oppressive, windowless with institutional gray walls and furniture bolted to the floor the kind of environment that made people want to talk just to fill the uncomfortable silence. Torres began with gentle questions about Lucas's relationship with his brother, allowing the boy to establish a baseline of responses before confronting him with the evidence that would ultimately break down his denials. Lucas initially maintained that he loved his brother and had been devastated by the accident, his affect flat and his answers delivered in a monotone that suggested either severe trauma or practiced deception. It was impossible to tell which. But when Torres produced photographs of the green hoodie fibers found in Ethan's hand, blown up to show the microscopic details that made them identifiable, Lucas's composure began to crack. His breathing quickened. His hands started fidgeting with the zipper of the jail-issued jumpsuit he now wore, and his eyes darted between the photos and Torres's face, looking for some escape from the trap that was closing around him. The turning point in the interrogation came when Detective Torres presented the evidence of the deleted internet searches, displaying printouts of each search query along with the timestamps. Lucas's attorney immediately advised him not to answer any questions about his phone usage, but the damage was done. The boy's face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized how thoroughly his attempted cover-up had failed, how investigators had recovered the very information he'd tried so hard to erase. Torres methodically laid out the forensic evidence piece by piece, creating a wall of proof that surrounded Lucas with no apparent exit. The fiber match that placed him in physical contact with Ethan during the attack, the bloody footprint that proved he'd stood over his brother's dying body, the blood on the hoodie and shoes that couldn't be explained away. The searches about making murder look like an accident that demonstrated planning and intent. Each piece of evidence was presented with calm professionalism, not as an accusation exactly, but as an invitation for Lucas to explain how all this evidence could possibly point to anyone but him. If he had an innocent explanation, now was the time to provide it. But no explanation came, just increasing distress as the weight of the evidence became undeniable. The teenager's lawyer called for a break, and during that 30-minute intermission where they conferred in private, Lucas apparently decided that denying the obvious was futile. When they resumed the interview, he asked in a small voice if he could speak with just Detective Torres alone, without the lawyers present. His attorney reluctantly agreed after ensuring that Lucas understood he was giving up certain protections by doing so. And then, in that stark interrogation room with only Torres present and the camera still rolling, 13-year-old Lucas Lopez confessed to murdering his brother. What he said in those next hours would provide crucial insight into not just what happened, but why. And the why would prove to be almost as important as the act itself in understanding this tragedy. The confession that Lucas Lopez gave to Detective Torres on March 17, 2022, was both heartbreaking and horrifying in its matter-of-fact recitation of fratricide, delivered in the flat, emotional tone of someone describing a mundane daily task rather than the killing of a family member. Lucas explained that on March 15th, he'd been playing on his custom gaming console, an expensive setup his parents had bought him for Christmas, with a high-end computer and specialized equipment, when Ethan had come into his room asking to play too. Lucas had told him no, explaining that he was in the middle of an important online match with his friends, a competitive game where leaving would cost his team the victory and damage his ranking. But Ethan had persisted the way younger siblings do, begging and pleading, not understanding or caring about the importance of what Lucas was doing. When words didn't work, Ethan had grabbed at the controller, trying to take it from Lucas's hands. In the ensuing struggle, Ethan had knocked the gaming console off the desk, sending it crashing to the floor where the hard drive was damaged beyond repair. Thousands of dollars of equipment and countless hours of game progress destroyed in an instant. Lucas described feeling like something broke inside me too, a red fog descending over his vision, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst from his chest. He testified that he'd grabbed the tactical flashlight from his father's duty belt, which he'd taken earlier that day. He claimed he felt safer having it, though he couldn't or wouldn't explain why he felt unsafe in his own home. And then he followed Ethan into the hallway, his brother trying to flee, perhaps sensing that something terrible was about to happen. What happened next was described in chilling detail that would later be played for the jury, every word preserved on video. Lucas had struck Ethan from behind, a cowardly blow to the back of the head that knocked the smaller boy to the floor. Then he'd forced his younger brother to his knees. Ethan was crying, begging, promising he'd fix the console or buy a new one with his allowance, before delivering the fatal blows with systematic precision. The psychological dimensions of Lucas's confession revealed something that would become central to understanding this case: the toxic influence of his father's example on his developing moral framework. Lucas told Detective Torres something that made the detective's blood run cold. He hadn't really thought of what he was doing as murder. In his mind, twisted by years of witnessing his father's behavior, he was disciplining Ethan for destroying his property, applying the same kind of violent correction that Sheriff Harrington had used on him countless times throughout his childhood. He'd watched his father solve problems through intimidation and force, whether it was with suspects brought into the station, with community members who challenged his authority at public meetings, or with his own family when they stepped out of line or disappointed him. Violence wasn't murder in Lucas's fractured understanding. It was problem-solving. It was establishing dominance. It was what strong men did when weaker people caused problems. The tactical flashlight itself had symbolic significance that couldn't be ignored. Lucas had specifically chosen his father's weapon, perhaps unconsciously seeking to emulate the man he both feared and sought to please, using the very instrument his father carried as a symbol of authority. This revelation suggested that Lucas's crime wasn't just an isolated act of violence born from rage, but the inevitable outcome of growing up in a household where brutality was normalized and modeled by the person who was supposed to protect him, where the line between discipline and abuse had been erased so completely that a child couldn't tell the difference. Lucas also revealed during his confession something that would have devastating implications for his parents. He'd been off his antipsychotic medication for intermittent explosive disorder for approximately 6 months before the murder. His parents had discontinued his prescription after his father's health insurance changed, making the medication prohibitively expensive at over $800 per month, a cost that seemed enormous to them. Though, as investigators would later discover, it was money they could have afforded if they'd been willing to make different choices about their spending priorities. Lucas described how his anger had become progressively harder to control without the medication, how he'd experienced violent fantasies about hurting people who annoyed him, how the rage would build up inside him like pressure in a boiler with no release valve. He'd even started harming animals as an outlet for his rage, a fact that would lead investigators to previous incidents that had been covered up. His mother had known about the medication lapse, Lucas explained, and had promised to find a cheaper alternative or work with his psychiatrist to get samples or assistance programs. But she'd been too busy with her blog to follow through, too consumed with creating content and building her brand to actually address her son's deteriorating mental health. The neglect was both medical and moral. His parents had recognized that he was deteriorating, had seen the warning signs, but had chosen to prioritize other things: their reputation, their lifestyle, their public image. This context didn't excuse Lucas's crime, didn't make him any less responsible for choosing violence over seeking help. But it raised serious questions about whether his parents bore criminal responsibility for creating the conditions that made murder not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. The part of Lucas's confession that most troubled Detective Torres, that would haunt him in the months and years to come, was the boy's description of his emotional state after killing Ethan. Lucas explained that after delivering the fatal blow, he'd stood over his brother's body and felt nothing: no remorse, no horror, no shock at what he'd done. Just a practical concern about how to make the death look accidental, how to protect himself from consequences. He'd watched as his brother's breathing became shallow and then stopped, as the blood pooled around Ethan's head, and he'd felt only calculation. He dragged Ethan's body to the top of the stairs, positioned it carefully, and then pushed it down to the landing, attempting to create the appearance of a fall. But the body hadn't landed correctly. It looked wrong, staged, obvious, and Lucas had panicked, realizing that his amateur staging attempt would never fool investigators. So he'd gone to find his father, planning initially to confess, to throw himself on parental mercy and beg for help. But when Sheriff Harrington saw Ethan's body, he hadn't called for an ambulance immediately or demanded answers. Instead, he'd immediately started constructing the accident narrative, telling Lucas to go to his room and stay there, to let him handle everything. Lucas's confession implicated not just himself, but his father in an attempted cover-up, suggesting that Sheriff Harrington had recognized his son as the killer within moments of seeing the scene and had chosen to protect Lucas rather than seek justice for Ethan. It was a decision that would ultimately destroy what remained of the Harrington family and add criminal charges to a father who had already failed his children in every way that mattered. The revelation that Sheriff Marcus Harrington had potentially helped stage the crime scene sent shockwaves through the state police investigation, transforming what was already a horrific case into something that struck at the very foundation of public trust in law enforcement. Detective Torres immediately obtained a warrant to seize all of the sheriff's personal and professional communications, looking for evidence that he'd known Lucas was responsible and had actively worked to cover it up. The scope of the warrant was broad, encompassing emails, text messages, phone records, and even his official sheriff's department communications, anything that might reveal what Harrington knew and when he knew it. The sheriff's behavior on the night of the murder took on new significance when examined through this lens. His insistence that state police weren't needed, his attempts to control who had access to the scene, his specific and detailed narrative about Ethan falling down the stairs that he'd repeated over and over like a script he'd memorized. Text messages recovered from the sheriff's phone showed something that would prove devastating to any defense he might mount. He'd called his personal attorney before calling 911. Think about that for a moment. A father finds his son dead or dying at the bottom of the stairs, and his first call isn't to emergency services, but to a lawyer. That single decision suggested he knew this wasn't a simple accident, that he understood there would be legal implications, that he was already thinking about protection and liability rather than saving his child's life. Torres also discovered that Sheriff Harrington had deleted his own text exchanges with Lucas from the evening of the murder, though forensic analysis of the phone recovered fragments showing the sheriff had texted his son with cleanup advice shortly before calling emergency services. "Get rid of it," one fragment read. "Make sure," said another. The context was lost, but the implications were clear enough to support obstruction charges. The 6-hour interrogation of Lucas Lopez concluded with the teenager being formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Ethan Thompson, a decision that came after extensive consultation between Detective Torres, the district attorney's office, and juvenile justice experts. Despite his age, just 13 years old when he committed the murder, 14 by the time charges were filed, Colorado law allowed for juveniles as young as 12 to be charged as adults for serious felonies, and prosecutors determined that the premeditation evidenced by the deleted searches warranted adult prosecution. It was a controversial decision that would spark immediate debate, but prosecutors argued that the severity of the crime and the planning involved made it appropriate to charge Lucas as an adult rather than in juvenile court, where the penalties would be substantially less severe and where he would be automatically released at age 21 regardless of rehabilitation progress. Lucas was transported to a juvenile detention facility in Denver to await trial, his life as a free person effectively over before his 14th birthday. As Detective Torres watched the boy being led away in shackles, hands cuffed in front of him, ankles hobbled so he could only take small shuffling steps, he felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction at solving the case and profound sorrow at the waste of multiple young lives. Ethan Thompson would never grow up, would never graduate from elementary school, never experience his first crush or his first job or the thousands of small moments that make up a life. And Lucas Lopez, barring some legal miracle or future change in sentencing laws, would spend the rest of his life in prison, his adolescence and adulthood consumed by concrete walls and razor wire, his entire existence reduced to a cell number and a crime that would define him forever. The fiber evidence from Ethan's clenched fist became a powerful symbol during the development of the case for trial, an image that prosecutor Nora Hughes knew would resonate with jurors on an emotional level that transcended the technical forensic details. Hughes, assigned to try the case in Aspen, Colorado, saw those green fibers as physical proof of Ethan's desperate final struggle for survival, a child's last act of resistance preserved in the very fabric that had clothed his killer. She envisioned showing enlarged photographs to the jury, asking them to imagine an 8-year-old boy grabbing at his brother's clothes, his small fingers clutching at anything that might save him, begging for mercy that never came. The fibers represented not just scientific evidence that could be measured and analyzed, but human tragedy, a tangible reminder that this wasn't an abstract legal exercise, but a real child who had fought for his life and lost. Hughes knew that jurors would be predisposed to sympathy for a 13-year-old defendant, that they might struggle with the concept of charging a child with adult murder, that defense attorneys would exploit every ounce of that natural reluctance to condemn someone so young. But those fibers would force them to confront the reality of what Lucas had done, to remember that Ethan Thompson had fought for his life, and to understand that the physical evidence proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. This wasn't a case where you could hide behind uncertainty or give the defendant the benefit of the doubt. The evidence was too clear, too overwhelming, too impossible to explain away with any innocent narrative. The state police investigation into the Harrington family's history uncovered a pattern of escalating violence that Sheriff Marcus Harrington had systematically covered up using his position and connections, a trail of incidents that should have resulted in intervention but instead disappeared into the black hole of official corruption. Detective Torres assigned a team to canvass Millbrook and surrounding communities, interviewing neighbors, teachers, school administrators, and anyone who had interacted with Lucas Lopez over the previous 2 years. What emerged from dozens of interviews was a portrait of a deeply troubled adolescent whose warning signs had been ignored, suppressed, or explained away by parents more concerned with maintaining their public image than protecting their children or their community. The picture that developed was damning not just of the parents, but of a system that had allowed those parents to operate with impunity. The first major revelation came from Jennifer Martinez, the neighbor who lived 3 houses down from the Harringtons, who reported something that should have resulted in immediate intervention but instead had been buried. In August 2021, she had witnessed Lucas torturing her family's dog in the wooded area behind their properties, an incident so disturbing that it still haunted her months later. Martinez had found Lucas holding her golden retriever, Buddy, pinned to the ground while burning the dog's paws with cigarette lighters, laughing as the animal yelped in pain and terror. The image of a child finding joy in an animal's suffering is one of the most reliable predictors of future violence against humans. It's such a well-established warning sign that law enforcement and mental health professionals treat it as a massive red flag requiring immediate intervention. Martinez had immediately called the sheriff's department, expecting that deputies would respond and that Lucas would face consequences for animal cruelty, potentially including psychological evaluation and treatment. But when deputies arrived, Sheriff Harrington had taken over the call, dismissed his subordinates with barely concealed irritation, and told Martinez that Lucas was experiencing a mental health episode and would be getting treatment. The dog torture incident should have resulted in charges of animal cruelty under Colorado law and mandatory psychological evaluation to assess whether Lucas posed a danger to others. But Sheriff Harrington had used his authority to ensure the report disappeared, transforming a potential criminal case into a non-event that existed only in Martinez's memory and the incomplete fragments of official records that Harrington couldn't fully erase. Detective Torres obtained internal sheriff's department records showing that the incident had been logged as a welfare check, no action needed, rather than as a criminal complaint or even as a matter requiring follow-up. No report had been filed with animal control, which should have been automatic given the nature of the complaint. No investigation had been conducted beyond the sheriff's cursory dismissal of his own deputies. And Jennifer Martinez had been told, in terms that felt more like a threat than a reassurance, that pursuing the matter would only traumatize a mentally ill child who couldn't control his actions, with the implication hanging in the air that making trouble for the sheriff's family could result in consequences for her own family. Martinez told investigators that she'd been intimidated into silence by the sheriff's reputation and his implied suggestion that making trouble for his family could result in slower response times when she needed police assistance, a form of coercion that was subtle but effective. The deliberate suppression of this incident demonstrated that Sheriff Harrington had been aware of his son's capacity for violence and had chosen to protect Lucas rather than address his escalating pathology. The second incident uncovered by investigators was even more serious and had occurred in October 2021 at Millbrook Middle School, just 2 months after the dog torture incident. 2 months during which Lucas should have been receiving intensive treatment, but instead had received nothing. Lucas had gotten into a dispute with a classmate named Derek Wilson during lunch period, one of those everyday school conflicts that usually gets resolved with words or maybe a shove. But when Derek had made fun of Lucas's clothes, a thoughtless bit of adolescent cruelty, the kind of thing that happens in middle school cafeterias everywhere. Lucas had responded with explosive violence that shocked everyone who witnessed it. He'd grabbed Derek's head and smashed it into a cafeteria table repeatedly, continuing the assault even after Derek was unconscious, until other students physically pulled him off. The force of the attack was such that Derek had suffered a severe concussion, a fractured cheekbone, and required 18 stitches to close a gash across his forehead that left a permanent scar. School officials had called the sheriff's department to file assault charges, following their mandatory reporting protocols for violent incidents on campus. But once again, Sheriff Harrington had intervened, showing up at the school in full uniform to assert his authority. He'd met privately with the school principal and Derek's parents, offering to pay all medical expenses and ensure Lucas received intensive therapy if they agreed not to press charges. The Wilson family, intimidated by the sheriff's position and genuinely worried about retaliation given his control over local law enforcement, had reluctantly agreed to the deal. Derek had been left with physical scars and psychological trauma, while Lucas had been suspended for just 10 days before returning to school as if nothing had happened. Detective Torres interviewed Derek's parents, Mark and Susan Wilson, who expressed guilt and anger that their decision to let the matter drop had potentially contributed to Ethan's death. "If we'd pressed charges," Susan Wilson said through tears, "maybe Lucas would have gotten court-ordered treatment. Maybe Ethan would still be alive." The third suppressed incident was perhaps the most chilling because it demonstrated that even Jacqueline Harrington had recognized her son was dangerous, had feared for her own life, and still nothing had been done to protect the family or the community. In December 2021, just 3 months before Ethan's murder, Jacqueline had called 911 in a panic, reporting that Lucas had threatened to kill her during an argument about his refusal to do homework. When deputies arrived, they found Jacqueline locked in the master bedroom with Lucas pounding on the door and screaming death threats graphic enough that the responding officers documented them in their initial reports. The deputies had witnessed a child completely out of control, exhibiting behavior that any reasonable person would recognize as dangerous, and they had recommended that Lucas be placed on a psychiatric hold for immediate evaluation, a 72-hour involuntary commitment that would allow mental health professionals to assess whether he posed an imminent threat to himself or others. But Sheriff Harrington had arrived on scene and once again shut down the investigation, explaining to his deputies that Lucas had stopped taking his medication due to insurance issues and that the family was working with a private psychiatrist to find alternatives. The deputies had reluctantly accepted their boss's explanation, documenting the incident as a domestic disturbance resolved by family and clearing the scene. Investigators obtained the original incident report that the deputies had written before the sheriff's intervention, which included one deputy's handwritten notation that would prove chillingly prescient. "This kid is going to kill someone if he doesn't get help." That deputy, Thomas Brennan, would later testify that he'd been ordered by Sheriff Harrington to delete that assessment from the official report, to sanitize the record to make it appear as though Lucas's behavior had been concerning but manageable rather than an emergency requiring immediate intervention. The pattern of suppression revealed by these 3 incidents was devastatingly clear, creating a narrative that would prove crucial not just to understanding how Ethan's murder happened, but to building criminal cases against both parents. Sheriff Marcus Harrington had recognized that his son was dangerous, had witnessed Lucas's escalating violence firsthand through multiple serious incidents, but had repeatedly chosen to use his authority and influence to protect Lucas from consequences rather than get him proper treatment or remove him from situations where he could harm others. It wasn't ignorance or negligence in the traditional sense. It was active suppression, a conscious choice to prioritize reputation over safety, image over intervention. Detective Torres met with the district attorney's office to discuss additional charges against the sheriff, laying out the evidence of systematic cover-ups that had enabled Lucas's violence to escalate unchecked until it culminated in murder. After reviewing the evidence and consulting with legal experts on law enforcement misconduct, prosecutors determined that Harrington could be charged with obstruction of justice for suppressing the dog torture and school assault incidents, as well as child endangerment for failing to seek appropriate mental health treatment for Lucas despite knowing he was a threat to himself and others. On March 23, 2022, Sheriff Marcus Harrington was arrested at his home by the same state police officers he'd tried to keep out of his investigation just days earlier, his law enforcement career ending in handcuffs and a perp walk captured by every news outlet in Colorado. The symbolism was powerful and intentional. A sheriff being treated like any other criminal suspect. No special privileges, no professional courtesy that might suggest law enforcement protected its own even when they violated the public trust. The arrest of Sheriff Harrington transformed the case from a tragic family murder into a broader indictment of systemic failure and abuse of power, a story that resonated far beyond Colorado's borders. News outlets across the country picked up the story, fascinated by the shocking image of a uniformed sheriff being led into court in shackles to face charges stemming from his son's murder of his other son. Legal analysts debated whether Harrington's actions rose to the level of criminal negligence, or if he was simply a father who'd made tragically bad decisions while trying to protect his troubled child. Though most agreed that using his official position to suppress evidence crossed a line that separated bad parenting from criminal conduct. For the residents of Millbrook and the broader Aspen community, the sheriff's arrest confirmed their worst suspicions about the corruption that could fester when law enforcement operated without oversight or accountability. Several victims of Lucas's previous violence came forward to the media, no longer afraid of retaliation now that the sheriff was in custody, expressing rage that Harrington had prioritized his family's reputation over public safety and potentially preventing intervention that could have saved Ethan's life. The psychological evaluation ordered for Lucas as part of his pretrial proceedings provided crucial insight into how untreated mental illness combined with learned violence had created a child capable of murder. Dr. Elizabeth Tran, a forensic psychologist specializing in juvenile offenders, spent 12 hours interviewing Lucas over multiple sessions, administering standardized psychological assessments and conducting detailed clinical interviews. Her report, filed with the court and eventually made public, diagnosed Lucas with intermittent explosive disorder, conduct disorder, and emerging antisocial personality traits, a constellation of diagnoses that painted a picture of serious psychological dysfunction. Dr. Tran noted in her report something that would become central to the trial. Lucas showed minimal remorse for killing Ethan, viewing his brother's death primarily through the lens of how it had disrupted his own life rather than as a moral wrong or a tragedy for Ethan. When asked how he felt about Ethan being dead, Lucas had responded that he felt bad about being in jail and angry that this happened, framing himself as the victim of circumstances rather than the perpetrator of violence. The psychologist documented that Lucas had been socialized into viewing violence as an appropriate response to frustration by witnessing his father's behavior over years, internalizing the message that might makes right, and that people who cause problems deserve to be hurt. The discontinuation of his antipsychotic medication had removed the chemical brake on his explosive rage, leaving him with no buffer between impulse and action. Most disturbingly, Dr. Tran concluded that Lucas posed a high risk for future violence and would require intensive long-term treatment in a secure setting to ever be safely released into the community. If rehabilitation was even possible given the severity of his disorders and the developmental stage at which the violence had become entrenched. The revelation about Lucas's discontinued medication became a central focus of the state's case against both Lucas and his father, providing context that explained how the violence escalated while also demonstrating parental neglect that bordered on criminal. Medical records obtained from Lucas's psychiatrist, Dr. James Wong, showed that the boy had been prescribed a combination of antipsychotic and mood-stabilizing medications starting in February 2021 following a series of violent outbursts at school and home that had alarmed teachers and family members alike. The medications had been remarkably effective in reducing Lucas's aggressive episodes, and Dr. Wong had noted significant improvement in his behavior and emotional regulation within weeks of starting treatment. But when Sheriff Harrington's employer switched insurance providers in September 2021, the new plan didn't cover the specific medications Lucas was taking, and the out-of-pocket cost would have been approximately $800 per month, a significant sum, but one that should have been manageable for a family with the Harringtons' income and resources. Rather than finding alternative medications that were covered, paying the cost, or working with Dr. Wong to find assistance programs or generic equivalents, Jacqueline and Marcus Harrington had simply stopped filling Lucas's prescriptions. They told Dr. Wong they were seeking treatment through a different provider, a lie designed to prevent him from reporting them to Child Protective Services for medical neglect. The psychiatrist had sent multiple letters warning that abruptly discontinuing the medications could lead to severe consequences, including increased aggression, loss of impulse control, and potential harm to himself or others. But the Harringtons had never responded to those warnings. The financial decision to stop Lucas's medication took on even darker implications when investigators examined Jacqueline Harrington's blog income, revealing that the family's claims of financial hardship were false and that the decision to discontinue treatment was based on priorities rather than necessity. Her Mountain Mama Musings platform had grown into a lucrative business with sponsorship deals, affiliate marketing, and premium subscription content generating an estimated $6,000 to $8,000 per month, far more than enough to cover Lucas's medication costs while still maintaining the family's affluent lifestyle. But as Detective Torres dug deeper into her blog archives, searching for evidence of what she knew and when she knew it, he discovered something that would become a bombshell revelation at trial. Jacqueline had been writing extensively about her struggles parenting a troubled teen, and she'd been monetizing Lucas's mental health crisis. She'd created a series of sponsored posts about dealing with difficult children, complete with brand partnerships and affiliate links to products she claimed helped her cope. She'd sold an e-book titled, When Love Isn't Enough, Parenting the Impossible Child, for $19.99, marketing it to other parents struggling with behavioral issues. And she'd charged subscribers $25 per month for access to detailed journals about Lucas's behavioral problems, giving paying customers a front-row seat to her son's deteriorating mental health. Jacqueline Harrington had literally been profiting from her son's suffering while refusing to pay for the medication that could have prevented his descent into violence. The discovery was so shocking, so fundamentally disturbing, that even seasoned prosecutors who thought they'd seen every variety of bad parenting found themselves stunned by the callousness it represented. The discovery of Jacqueline's blog exploitation led to additional charges being filed against her, transforming her from a grieving mother into a defendant facing serious criminal liability. While prosecutors couldn't directly charge her with causing Ethan's death, the legal chain of causation was too attenuated, requiring too many intervening choices by Lucas. They could pursue charges of child abuse and neglect for failing to provide necessary medical care to Lucas, as well as exploitation of a minor for using Lucas's mental illness for financial gain without his consent and against his interests. The blog posts themselves were damning pieces of evidence, with Jacqueline describing Lucas's violent outbursts in graphic detail, sharing photos of damage he'd caused during rages, and positioning herself as a martyred mother coping with an unmanageable child while never mentioning the crucial context that would have changed the entire narrative. What was conspicuously absent from any of her posts was the fact that she'd stopped his medication, that his psychiatrist was begging her to seek emergency intervention, or that multiple incidents of serious violence had been covered up by her husband. The omissions were as damning as the content itself, showing a deliberate pattern of exploitation that presented only the information that generated engagement and revenue, while hiding the information that would have revealed her culpability. Jacqueline Harrington's carefully curated online persona, as Mountain Mama, was revealed to be a grotesque performance, a mother profiting from her child's suffering while ensuring that suffering would continue to provide content for her lucrative platform. It was exploitation dressed up as authenticity, monetization disguised as vulnerability. The charging decisions for all three members of the Harrington family created a legal situation unprecedented in Colorado history, a case that would wind its way through the courts over more than a year. Lucas Lopez faced first-degree murder charges as an adult, potentially resulting in a sentence of life without parole despite his age at the time of the offense, the harshest possible penalty short of death, which Colorado didn't allow for juveniles. Sheriff Marcus Harrington faced charges of obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and abuse of public office, charges that could result in decades in prison if convicted on all counts. Jacqueline Harrington faced charges of child abuse, neglect, and exploitation of a minor, with potential sentences that could keep her imprisoned into her 60s. The cases would all proceed separately to avoid the legal complications of trying family members together, but they were inextricably linked by the central tragedy of Ethan Thompson's murder and the systematic failures that had made that murder possible. Prosecutor Nora Hughes knew that the cases against the parents would be complex and possibly controversial, with defense attorneys likely to argue that the parents were being scapegoated for their son's crime and that charging them criminally for parenting failures set a dangerous precedent. But Hughes was determined to hold all responsible parties accountable for their roles in creating the conditions that led to an 8-year-old boy being bludgeoned to death by his older brother in what should have been the safest place in the world, his own home. The formal arrest of Sheriff Marcus Harrington on March 23, 2022, marked the beginning of a parallel investigation into how he had systematically abused his position to cover up his son's escalating violence, using the very authority entrusted to him to protect the public to instead endanger them. Detective Torres worked with internal affairs investigators from the Colorado State Police to examine every aspect of Harrington's 18-year career, looking for patterns of misconduct, intimidation, and official corruption that might extend beyond his son's crimes. What they discovered painted a picture of a law enforcement officer who had increasingly seen himself as above the law, using his badge and authority to protect himself and his family from consequences, while ordinary citizens were held to a different standard. The investigation revealed that Harrington had quashed at least 7 traffic citations for family members over the years, had failed to file reports on 3 domestic disturbance calls at his own home prior to the murder, and had actively intimidated witnesses to his son's violence by implying that making official complaints could result in professional or personal retaliation. It was a pattern of corruption that had operated in plain sight, enabled by a culture of deference to law enforcement and a community reluctant to challenge someone with the sheriff's power and connections. The dog torture incident from August 2021 became the centerpiece of the obstruction of justice case against Sheriff Harrington, providing the clearest example of how he had used his official position to suppress evidence of criminal conduct. Prosecutors obtained statements from the deputies who had initially responded to Jennifer Martinez's call, both of whom confirmed that they had wanted to file animal cruelty charges against Lucas, but had been ordered by their sheriff to stand down and delete their preliminary reports. One deputy, Thomas Brennan, provided particularly damaging testimony during the investigation phase. He testified that Sheriff Harrington had explicitly told him that cops take care of their own, and that filing charges against a fellow officer's son would be seen as a betrayal of the thin blue line, that unwritten code of loyalty that sometimes crosses the line from professional solidarity into criminal conspiracy. Brennan had reluctantly complied with the order at the time, fearing for his career and his family's financial security if he defied the sheriff. But he'd kept his own notes of the incident, a personal insurance policy that he now turned over to investigators. Those notes described finding Jennifer Martinez's dog with severe burns on its paws, Lucas holding cigarette lighters and laughing at the animal's distress, and the dog's obvious terror when Lucas approached it even after the attack had ended. The notes also documented Sheriff Harrington's arrival on scene and his immediate move to control the narrative, telling the deputies in no uncertain terms that Lucas had a mental illness and couldn't be held responsible for his actions, as if mental illness was a blanket excuse for criminal behavior rather than a factor requiring treatment and intervention. The school assault incident from October 2021 provided even more damning evidence of Sheriff Harrington's pattern of obstruction, showing how he had weaponized his position to intimidate civilians into silence. Detective Torres interviewed the principal of Millbrook Middle School, Dr. Patricia Green, who explained that school policy required reporting violent assaults to law enforcement for potential prosecution, a mandatory reporting requirement designed to ensure that serious violence didn't go unaddressed. She'd made the call to the sheriff's department following Lucas's attack on Derek Wilson, expecting that the normal juvenile justice protocols would be followed: an investigation, potential charges, court-ordered evaluation, and treatment. Instead, Sheriff Harrington had arrived at the school in full uniform, a deliberate choice designed to intimidate, and demanded a meeting with Dr. Green in private. During that meeting, according to Green's contemporaneous notes that she'd preserved in the school's confidential files, the sheriff had explicitly threatened that if charges were filed against Lucas, he would make life difficult for the school. The threats were specific and credible: increased DUI checkpoints near school events that would inconvenience parents and donors, strict enforcement of noise ordinances during football games that would hamper school spirit and fundraising, and code enforcement inspections of school facilities that would find violations requiring expensive remediation. Green had caved to the pressure, agreeing to handle the incident internally through suspension rather than involving the justice system. But she documented the threats in a memo to the school district's legal counsel, a memo that now became crucial evidence of Harrington's corruption. The Derek Wilson assault also revealed the financial inducements Sheriff Harrington had used to buy silence, adding witness tampering to the growing list of charges against him. Derek's parents, Mark and Susan Wilson, told investigators that the sheriff had offered them $15,000 in cash to cover Derek's medical expenses and to sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing them from discussing Lucas's role in the assault with anyone, including other parents at the school. The Wilsons had reluctantly accepted, worried that challenging a law enforcement official would put their family at risk and swayed by the sheriff's assurances that Lucas would receive intensive treatment. But after Ethan's murder, they'd come to bitterly regret their decision, believing that if they'd pressed charges, Lucas might have received court-ordered treatment that could have prevented the fratricide. The existence of the NDA and the cash payment demonstrated that Sheriff Harrington had been consciously engaged in a cover-up, using money and intimidation to suppress evidence of his son's dangerousness. Prosecutors added witness tampering to Harrington's charges, and the Wilsons agreed to testify against him in exchange for immunity from any potential prosecution for accepting the payment. Their testimony would prove powerful at trial, showing a sheriff who viewed his badge not as a symbol of public service, but as a tool for protecting his family from accountability, while ordinary citizens faced the full weight of the law for far lesser offenses. The December 2021 incident where Lucas had threatened to kill his mother provided the foundation for the child endangerment charges against Sheriff Harrington, demonstrating that he'd been explicitly warned about the danger his son posed and had chosen to do nothing. The responding deputy's original reports, recovered from the department's computer system before Harrington could delete them, described a scene of extreme danger with Lucas being physically restrained while screaming death threats specific enough that they couldn't be dismissed as adolescent hyperbole. One deputy had specifically recommended an emergency psychiatric hold, invoking Colorado's mental health commitment statutes that allowed for involuntary hospitalization when someone posed an imminent threat. Sheriff Harrington had overruled that recommendation with the full weight of his authority and had pressured his deputies to downgrade the incident to a routine domestic disturbance that required no follow-up. Jacqueline Harrington told investigators during her own interview something that would prove devastating to her husband's defense. She testified that she'd begged Marcus to have Lucas committed that night, that she'd been genuinely terrified Lucas would kill her if he had another opportunity, that she'd pleaded for protection and been denied. But Marcus had insisted that committing their son would destroy his career and the family's reputation, priorities that apparently outweighed his wife's safety and his son's need for treatment. The sheriff had valued his public image over his wife's life and his son's mental health, a decision that would prove fatal for Ethan less than 3 months later. That calculation, reputation over safety, image over intervention, would become the central theme of the prosecution's case against both parents. The state's case against Sheriff Harrington for child endangerment rested on the legal argument that he had a duty as both a parent and a law enforcement officer to protect his children and community, and that he had systematically violated that duty through a pattern of deliberate choices. Legal experts brought in by prosecutor Nora Hughes explained that while parents generally have broad discretion in making medical decisions for their children, that discretion doesn't extend to withholding necessary treatment when a child poses a clear danger to others. Lucas's psychiatrist, Dr. James Wong, testified that he had sent Sheriff Harrington written warnings that discontinuing Lucas's medication without supervised tapering could result in catastrophic behavioral consequences, and that Lucas needed to be immediately hospitalized if his parents couldn't afford outpatient treatment. Harrington had ignored all of these warnings, never responding to the psychiatrist or seeking alternative care, never taking even basic steps to address the mounting evidence that his son was dangerous. That deliberate indifference to professional medical advice, combined with his active suppression of evidence of Lucas's violence, met the legal standard for child endangerment under Colorado law. The abuse of office charges against Sheriff Harrington focused on his use of official resources and authority to further his personal agenda of protecting Lucas, showing a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond the specific incidents of violence. Investigators discovered that Harrington had run background checks on Jennifer Martinez and the Wilson family using law enforcement databases, looking for anything he could use to discredit or intimidate them: arrests, financial problems, divorces, anything that might give him leverage or undermine their credibility if they spoke out. He'd also used his position to ensure that Lucas's name never appeared in any official incident reports, manually editing database entries and ordering subordinates to use generic descriptions like juvenile male rather than identifying Lucas by name. This systematic scrubbing of records meant that if Child Protective Services or other agencies had searched for Lucas's name, they would have found nothing: no pattern, no history, no red flags. Most egregiously, Harrington had placed surveillance on Derek Wilson's family after they'd accepted his payoff, using department resources and personnel to monitor whether they were complying with the non-disclosure agreement. He'd had deputies drive by their house, had run periodic background checks to see if they were in financial distress that might motivate them to talk, had essentially treated private citizens as suspects requiring monitoring. This misuse of government databases and equipment for personal purposes constituted a clear abuse of his official position and violated multiple department policies and state laws. The revelation of Sheriff Harrington's misconduct sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across Colorado and beyond, sparking conversations about accountability and oversight that had been long overdue. The Aspen County Sheriff's Department announced an independent review of all cases Harrington had handled during his tenure, concerned that his pattern of corruption might have extended to official investigations and that innocent people might have been convicted while guilty parties with connections to the sheriff went free. The state attorney general opened a civil rights investigation into whether Harrington's actions had created a pattern of selective enforcement that violated citizens' constitutional rights to equal protection under the law. Law enforcement professional organizations condemned Harrington's behavior, with the Colorado Sheriff's Association issuing a statement emphasizing that his actions were antithetical to the values of integrity and public service that should define law enforcement. For the residents of Millbrook and Aspen, the betrayal was deeply personal. They'd trusted Sheriff Harrington to protect their community, had voted for him in elections, had supported his initiatives, and believed his reassurances about public safety, only to discover that he'd been shielding a dangerous juvenile offender while allowing that offender's violence to escalate toward inevitable tragedy. The charging documents filed against Jacqueline Harrington on March 28, 2022, detailed her role in Lucas's descent into violence and her exploitation of his mental illness for profit, painting a picture of a mother who had monetized her son's suffering with chilling efficiency. The child abuse and neglect charges stemmed from her decision to discontinue Lucas's medication despite having the financial means to continue treatment and despite receiving explicit warnings from his psychiatrist about the dangers. Prosecutor Nora Hughes argued that Jacqueline had prioritized her lifestyle and her blog business over her son's medical needs, a decision that directly contributed to his inability to control his violent impulses. The exploitation charges focused on Jacqueline's monetization of Lucas's struggles without his knowledge or consent, using his mental health crisis as content for her Mountain Mama musings platform in ways that violated his privacy and dignity. Hughes obtained records showing that Jacqueline's blog posts specifically about Lucas's behavioral problems had generated over $40,000 in revenue through sponsorships, affiliate sales, and premium subscriptions, making his suffering literally profitable for her. That number, $40,000, was more than enough to pay for Lucas's medication for 4 years. The priorities couldn't have been clearer. The blog posts themselves became evidence in the criminal case against Jacqueline Harrington, with prosecutors presenting screenshots and archives to demonstrate the extent of her exploitation. In one particularly damning post from November 2021, just 4 months before the murder, Jacqueline had written about Lucas destroying furniture during a rage episode, included photos of the shattered coffee table and torn upholstery, and then pivoted seamlessly to a sponsored advertisement for home insurance that could cover such damage. The juxtaposition was grotesque, using her son's psychological breakdown as a setup for a sales pitch. In another post from January 2022, barely 2 months before Ethan's death, she described Lucas's increasing threats of violence in dramatic detail designed to generate engagement, and then transitioned smoothly to promoting a meditation app that she claimed helped her cope with the stress. The posts never mentioned that Lucas was off his prescribed medication, never acknowledged that he needed emergency psychiatric intervention, never expressed genuine concern for his well-being as opposed to concern about how his behavior affected her. They were simply content designed to generate clicks, engagement, and revenue, a mother exploiting her son's pain for profit while doing nothing to actually help him. The callousness of using a child's deteriorating mental health as a business strategy shocked even experienced prosecutors who thought they'd seen every form of parental exploitation. The three interconnected criminal cases, Lucas for murder, Marcus for obstruction and child endangerment, Jacqueline for abuse and exploitation, created a legal labyrinth that would dominate Colorado's court system for the next year and become a case study in how family dysfunction and systemic failure could combine to create tragedy. Defense attorneys for all three defendants immediately began filing motions to sever the cases, arguing that the intense media coverage and interconnected nature of the charges would make it impossible for any of them to receive a fair trial. The publicity had been extraordinary, with cable news networks covering every development and legal commentators debating the case endlessly. But prosecutor Nora Hughes successfully argued that the cases should proceed separately but with judicial coordination, as the evidence in each case was relevant to understanding the context of the others. Lucas's crime couldn't be fully understood without examining his parents' failures, and his parents' culpability was demonstrated in part by what their failures had enabled. The judge assigned to oversee all three cases, the Honorable Robert Shun, agreed to a coordinated approach that would allow the prosecution to build from Lucas's trial to his parents' trials, using the findings in each case to inform the next. Judge Chin set trial dates that would space the proceedings several months apart, giving lawyers time to prepare and preventing jury confusion that might result from trying multiple defendants simultaneously. The legal strategy was ambitious and potentially risky. If Lucas were acquitted, it might undermine the cases against his parents. But Hughes believed it was necessary to achieve justice for Ethan Thompson and accountability for all who had failed him. The pretrial proceedings for Lucas Lopez's murder case began in earnest in April 2022, with defense attorney Sarah Mitchell filing a flurry of motions challenging everything from the admissibility of Lucas's confession to the constitutionality of charging a 13-year-old as an adult. Mitchell, a veteran public defender specializing in juvenile cases with a reputation for aggressive advocacy, argued that Lucas had been subjected to coercive interrogation tactics despite his age and had not fully understood his rights when he waived them. She presented expert testimony from child psychologists explaining that adolescent brains are not fully developed, particularly in areas governing impulse control and understanding long-term consequences, and that Lucas couldn't have formed the specific intent required for first-degree murder. The defense's position was that Lucas's age and mental illness made him fundamentally different from an adult defendant and that treating him as an adult violated evolving standards of decency. Prosecutor Nora Hughes countered with the evidence of premeditation, the deleted internet searches conducted 3 days before the murder, the theft of his father's tactical flashlight, the attempted staging of the crime scene, arguing that Lucas had demonstrated a level of planning and consciousness of guilt that belied any claim of diminished capacity due to age. Hughes presented her own expert witnesses who testified that 13-year-olds are developmentally capable of understanding that murder is wrong and of planning their actions, even if their decision-making isn't as sophisticated as an adult's. The evidence showed not an impulsive act of violence, but calculated planning followed by methodical execution and attempted cover-up. The venue for Lucas's trial became a contentious issue, with both sides arguing about whether an impartial jury could be seated in Aspen given the intense media coverage that had saturated the region. Defense attorney Mitchell filed a motion for change of venue, presenting survey evidence showing that over 80% of potential jurors in the Aspen area had already formed opinions about Lucas's guilt based on news reports about his father's arrest and corruption. She argued that the pretrial publicity had been so extensive and so prejudicial that finding 12 impartial jurors would be impossible. But prosecutor Hughes successfully argued that the case should remain in Aspen, where Ethan had lived and died, where the community deserved to see justice served, and that with proper voir dire. The jury selection process. An impartial jury could be seated despite the publicity. Judge Robert Chin sided with the prosecution, ruling that the trial would be held in Aspen, but that jury selection would be extensive and would include detailed questions designed to identify and exclude anyone who had already decided Lucas's guilt or innocence. The judge also imposed a gag order on all parties, prohibiting them from making public statements about the case until after the verdict, an attempt to limit the pretrial publicity that had already saturated local and national media. It was a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but represented the judge's best effort to balance the defendant's right to a fair trial against the community's interest in public proceedings. Jury selection for Lucas Lopez's trial began on January 9, 2023, in a courtroom in Aspen, Colorado, that had been modified to accommodate the intense public interest in the case. Judge Chun had ordered that 200 prospective jurors be summoned, anticipating that a large percentage would be dismissed for cause due to pretrial knowledge or fixed opinions about guilt or innocence. The voir dire process was painstaking, with each potential juror being questioned individually about their knowledge of the case, their views on juvenile justice, their feelings about mental illness as a mitigating factor in criminal behavior, and their ability to consider a sentence of life without parole for a child. Many potential jurors broke down in tears when asked if they could vote to essentially end a 13-year-old's life by consigning him to permanent incarceration, and those who expressed certainty that they could not were dismissed for cause. After 5 grueling days of jury selection that saw dozens of potential jurors excused, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were finally seated, a group that included teachers, nurses, retirees, and small business owners, all of whom had sworn they could set aside their preconceptions and decide the case based solely on the evidence presented. The courtroom itself became a focal point of divided public opinion about the case, a physical manifestation of the moral debate that raged beyond its walls. The gallery seating was carefully managed by court security, with half the seats reserved for Ethan Thompson's extended family and supporters, identified by the blue ribbons they wore in his memory. The other half was reserved for supporters of Lucas Lopez, many wearing green ribbons to match the color of the hoodie that had become a symbol of the case, who argued that a 13-year-old couldn't be held fully accountable for his actions given his age and mental illness. The visual of the divided gallery, with blue and green ribbons creating a stark color divide down the center aisle, was captured by courtroom sketch artists. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, and became an iconic image representing the moral complexity of prosecuting child offenders. Victim impact advocates sat on the blue ribbon side, holding photos of Ethan and demanding justice for a murdered child. Juvenile justice reform activists sat on the green ribbon side, holding signs about brain development and rehabilitation. Both groups were united in their grief for Ethan but bitterly divided on whether Lucas deserved mercy or condemnation, whether his sentence should focus on punishment or the possibility of redemption. Prosecutor Nora Hughes's opening statement on January 16, 2023, was a masterclass in storytelling that humanized Ethan Thompson while building an irrefutable case against his killer. Hughes began by projecting a photo of Ethan on the courtroom's video screens, an 8-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile, wearing a Colorado Rockies baseball cap, his whole life ahead of him, a future that would never be realized. She described Ethan's love of dinosaurs, how he checked out every book about paleontology from the school library and dreamed of one day discovering a new species. She talked about his kindness to other children at his school, how he always invited the lonely kids to play at recess, how his teacher had described him as having the biggest heart in the 2nd grade. Then Hughes methodically walked the jury through the events of March 15, 2022, using timeline graphics, crime scene photos, and evidence exhibits to show how Lucas had researched murder, stolen his father's weapon, attacked Ethan from behind, and attempted to cover up the crime by staging a fall. She emphasized the physical evidence, the fibers clutched in Ethan's hand as he fought for his life, the blood spatter that told the story of a brutal beating, the deleted searches that proved Lucas had planned this for days. Hughes ended her opening by asking the jury to remember that while Lucas was a child, so was Ethan, and Ethan had been denied the chance to grow up because his older brother had chosen violence over mercy. The implication was clear. Sympathy for Lucas couldn't erase what he'd done to Ethan. Defense attorney Sarah Mitchell's opening statement took a dramatically different approach, portraying Lucas as another victim of failed systems and parental neglect. a child who had been set up to fail by the very people who should have protected him. Mitchell didn't deny that Lucas had killed Ethan. The evidence made denial impossible, and attempting it would have destroyed her credibility with the jury. But she argued that the jury needed to understand the context of how a 13-year-old could commit such an act. She described Lucas's intermittent explosive disorder, explaining it as a documented medical condition that caused uncontrollable rage episodes where rational thought became impossible. She painted Sheriff Marcus Harrington as an abusive father who had modeled violence as problem-solving, who had beaten Lucas and normalized brutality in their home, teaching his son that might makes right. She described Jacqueline Harrington's exploitation of Lucas's mental illness for blog profit while refusing to pay for his treatment, a betrayal that demonstrated her son was worth more to her as content than as a child needing help. Mitchell argued that Lucas had been set up to fail by the very people who should have protected him, and that while Ethan's death was an unspeakable tragedy, the law required consideration of Lucas's diminished capacity due to age and mental illness. She ended by urging the jury to remember that Lucas was still a child, that his brain wasn't fully developed, and that condemning him to die in prison would be giving up on the possibility of rehabilitation and redemption, giving up on a child that everyone else had already abandoned. The trial itself unfolded over 3 intense weeks, with the prosecution calling 47 witnesses who built a comprehensive narrative of Lucas's crime and consciousness of guilt. The testimony was at times technical, forensic experts explaining blood spatter patterns and fiber analysis, and at times deeply emotional, particularly when Ethan's grandmother Margaret Thompson took the stand and broke down while describing the gentle boy who would rescue insects from drowning in puddles. The most dramatic moment came when the video of Lucas's confession was played for the jury, showing his flat effect as he described bludgeoning Ethan to death, his matter-of-fact tone as he explained that he was disciplining his brother, his lack of remorse when asked if he felt bad about what he'd done. The defense's case focused on humanizing Lucas and contextualizing his crime within the framework of parental failure and untreated mental illness. Lucas himself took the stand, appearing small and vulnerable in the witness box, and testified about his troubled childhood and the day of Ethan's death. His testimony was both sympathetic, a child who'd been failed by every adult in his life, and disturbing, particularly when Prosecutor Hughes's cross-examination revealed inconsistencies and highlighted the planning that had preceded the murder. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and jury deliberation, the verdict came on February 19, 2023, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted with both cheers and sobs, blue ribbons celebrating justice while green ribbons mourned a different kind of tragedy. The sentencing hearing on February 28, 2023, was equally wrenching, with victim impact statements from Ethan's family painting a picture of a life cut short and a family destroyed. Judge Robert Chun, after carefully weighing aggravating and mitigating factors, sentenced Lucas Lopez to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 14, Lucas became the youngest person in Colorado history to receive that sentence, a distinction that immediately made his case a focal point for national debates about juvenile justice. The sentence meant that Lucas would spend his entire life behind bars, his adolescence, his 20s, his middle age, his elderly years, all within prison walls, never experiencing the milestones that define human life. In the aftermath of Lucas's sentencing, the criminal cases against his parents proceeded to their own conclusions. Sheriff Marcus Harrington pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and abuse of office, receiving a sentence of 15 years in prison. His law enforcement career was permanently over, his reputation destroyed, his pension forfeited. Jacqueline Harrington initially pleaded not guilty, but faced with overwhelming evidence and universal public condemnation, she eventually accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to child abuse and neglect in exchange for the exploitation charges being dropped and receiving a sentence of 8 years in prison. As part of her plea, she was required to permanently shut down all her blogs and social media platforms and to donate all revenue earned from content about Lucas or Ethan to a charity supporting victims of juvenile violence. The Lucas Lopez case became a landmark in Colorado criminal justice history and sparked a statewide debate about juvenile sentencing reform that continues to this day. Advocacy groups used Lucas's case as an example of why life without parole sentences for juveniles should be abolished, arguing that condemning a 13-year-old to die in prison violated basic human dignity and the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They pointed to research on adolescent brain development, the potential for rehabilitation even in serious offenders, and the disproportionate impact such sentences had on minority and mentally ill youth. But victims' rights organizations countered that some crimes, regardless of the perpetrator's age, were so heinous that the only appropriate response was permanent incarceration, and that Ethan Thompson's right to life had been permanently taken away by Lucas's choice. The divided courtroom gallery, blue ribbons for Ethan, green ribbons for Lucas, became a lasting symbol of the moral complexity surrounding juvenile justice. The Blue Ribbon supporters organized events honoring Ethan's memory and advocating for stronger protections for children against family violence, establishing the Ethan Thompson Foundation to promote mental health treatment and early intervention. The Green Ribbon supporters organized vigils outside the prison where Lucas was held and lobbied the state legislature to pass laws prohibiting life without parole sentences for offenders under age 14, arguing that condemning children to permanent imprisonment represented a failure of compassion. Ethan Thompson's legacy is preserved not just in memory, but in concrete action. His grandmother Margaret established the foundation that bears his name, dedicated to protecting children from family violence and improving access to mental health treatment for troubled youth. The foundation advocates for Ethan's Law, proposed state legislation that would require mandatory reporting and investigation of violent incidents involving juveniles, even when those incidents occur within law enforcement families. In Aspen, a small park was renamed Ethan Thompson Memorial Park, featuring a playground with dinosaur sculptures reflecting his love of paleontology, a place where children can play safely, enjoying the childhood that was stolen from Ethan on March 15, 2022. The case continues to reverberate through the legal system, with Lucas's appellate attorneys challenging his sentence on constitutional grounds. As of late 2025, that appeal remains pending, with both sides preparing extensive briefing on whether life without parole for a 13-year-old violates evolving standards of decency. Legal experts are divided on how the court will rule, but regardless of the outcome, the case has already ensured that Lucas Lopez's name will be remembered in legal history, not as he might have hoped, as a gaming champion or a successful adult, but as a tragic example of what can happen when parental failures, systemic inadequacies, and untreated mental illness converge in a child's life. And somewhere in a juvenile detention facility that will soon become an adult prison, Lucas Lopez lives with the consequences of the choice he made on that March evening when he followed his brother into a hallway and decided that a broken gaming console was worth a human life. Whether he will ever develop the empathy and remorse that was absent at his trial, whether he will ever truly understand what he took from Ethan and from himself, remains to be seen. But for Ethan Thompson, there are no second chances, no appeals, no possibility of redemption. There is only silence where laughter should be, absence where a life should have flourished, and a family forever shattered by violence that never had to happen.